You're still watching The Pulse with me, Gifty Ando, up here. As EU-African relations evolve, there seems to be more emphasis on collaborations on security, migration and climate change. At least that is what the new EU leadership seem to be focusing on. The new EU Commission President von der Leyen made her first trip outside of Europe, and her destination was an African country. At the first meeting of EU foreign ministers under the new EU Foreign Affairs representative, Africa came up as one key priority of the new EU leadership. So what exactly is the plan, and what's in it for African countries like Ghana? Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners, the DW. He's standing by in Berlin for our crossover today. Hi, Thomas. Good to see you once again. Now, do we know how the new EU leadership seems to be more African-focused, and why?
Gifty, first of all, it's a pleasure to be back on your program and talk to you, especially about this issue, which is becoming more and more important here in Europe, namely the relationship between the European Union and the African continent, and also in particular African countries. And the key element behind is that Ursula von der Leyen, the new head of the European Commission, as you said, made her first trip outside of Europe to an African country. She went to Ethiopia, and as she said there, she said she wanted to listen. She was not there to present a sort of grand plan for Africa, but rather just to listen what challenges and what opportunities are important for Africans in Africa, and based on that develop a joint project between the European Union and Africa as a whole, but also in particular with the African Union as well, and to try and understand, as I said, that there are opportunities, for example, economic opportunities, for example, when it comes to trade between African countries and European countries, but also there are very important challenges and problems that have to be tackled. I'm particularly thinking about security challenges in some countries, or the issue of migration, which we have discussed on various occasions here. And the understanding from the new European leadership is that they want to do this with Africa as equal partners, that there is an understanding that the challenges that both the European Union and Africa are facing can be solved only if the EU and Africa work together. And that's when, for example, another key issue comes in, namely the issue of climate and climate protection. It is interesting that Ursula von der Leyen also went to Madrid, for example, for the climate summit, and she stressed there once again that that will be one of her key priorities. And then when it comes to Africa, she stressed that that's a key priority that she also wants to develop hand in hand with Africa. So tackling some of those very big international issues together with the African continent, that, as she described, Ursula von der Leyen, Africa is the most natural partner for the European Union.
So as you lay down these big ideas that the EU seeks to pursue with Africa, what do we know about the EU-Africa foreign policy agenda? A bit more details, and also about the plan that the EU has for its relations with Africa at this time.
Gifty, you touch on a very important element, because this obviously sounds grand, it sounds very good, it sounds ambitious, and that's obviously the goal that the EU has here. They want to be more assertive on the foreign policy side of things, in particular because there has been criticism in the past that the EU is economically very powerful, but politically it could still do much more when it comes to tackling some of these international issues that we're talking about. And there is also criticism, and especially a few question marks about this Africa strategy, because there are those who say, okay, it sounds very good, but the big challenge is trying to make this reliable and good on the medium long term. It's not only about visiting Ethiopia or visiting an African country, it's about making policy priorities and policy goals that can be long lasting and have bring very good effects both for the European Union and for African countries. So that's where the European Union is trying to work, and it's trying to make progress. But again, Ursula von der Leyen clearly stated that at least this first key trip to Ethiopia, this first key travel to Africa, if you will, was about listening. It was not as, let's say, in the past, about presenting simply a plan that the European Union wants to work on. It's about listening and trying to make that plan together with Africa. But there are obviously clear strands, clear elements that you can already see are going to be developed. Trade, as I already mentioned, is a particular one. And obviously the issue of security, which is a bit worrisome as far as the European Union is concerned. That's not the case overall in Africa, but in particular African countries, it is certainly a big challenge and one that the European Union is particularly concerned about. So those are areas where the EU is planning to work hand in hand with Africa. That's on a bilateral issue, if you will. So migration, for example, or security or trade. But again, the European Union leadership stressed that it's about moving beyond that and also understanding that this is a partnership among equals and that you have to tackle some of the big global challenges as well together. And that's when the issue of climate protection comes particularly into mind.
Well, development analysts will tell you that the relationship may be much more complex than one of equals if you want to go into the nitty-gritties. But then, as they've indicated, there's the willingness to listen, open up and listen to what Africa has to say. I'm wondering, how is Africa expected to take advantage of this sort of arrangement, and how does the EU also stand to benefit so that there is really, at the end of the day, a win-win situation?
One of the issues, Gifty, where the EU is particularly interested in when it comes to Africa, and by the way, not only EU institutions, but also countries like, for example, right here in Germany, is the fact that Africa has a very big young population. So that's where they, for example, see many opportunities for Africans themselves, many opportunities where Europeans could try and work, for example, when it comes to bringing more investment to the country, to try and improving the employment situation in many countries around Africa. That's a situation where European leaders could see that there is a sort of win-win situation where European companies go to Africa, and on the other hand, Africans can get employment or jobs, or could get more opportunities when it comes to those sort of areas. That's one element that we've also, by the way, Gifty, discussed here in the past. In particular, when you talk about Germany, there's that idea of the compact with Africa, where Germany is working hand in hand with specific countries to try and improve the situation there. There's also the idea, at least from a European perspective, that one of the key goals is to try and improve life for Africans in their own specific countries, whether it comes for employment or improving the quality of life. The backdrop of all that, we've also discussed here, is the thought among Europeans that if you improve conditions for Africans at home, many will not feel the need to leave their countries of origin and move, for example, to Europe. And as you know, Europe is trying to control and let's say, make important changes when it comes to migration policy. So those are issues where the European Union at least sees that it can benefit, but it can also help Africans as such. And by the way, when Ursula von der Leyen talks about listening to Africa, she's also expecting Africans to come up with proposals where they see that they can get some improvements in their own lives and in their own livelihoods when it comes to that relationship between Africa and Europe.
All right, bottom line here is an opportunity. What you make of it is really up to you. Well, finally, Thomas, how have people within Europe, let's be specific and say Germany, for example, reacted to these moves by the EU?
I think there is an understanding in many European countries, and that's, I would say, certainly the case in Germany, that Africa is becoming more and more important for the European Union. Before, you may have thought that the key element was migration, but I think more and more Europeans are understanding that Africa, as I said just earlier, is a place where you can find many opportunities. It is still difficult, for example, for European businesses to open up to working in many African countries, but this is something that, at least from a German perspective, German officials are trying to change. They're trying to make companies, for example, understand that Africa can be a very important destination for them as well. And I would also say that from a general population, there is a sense that this can be the case. At the same time, I think there is a bit of wariness when it comes to simply talking about Africa as one place, when there is also an evident understanding, at least among the officials and German politicians, that you also have to understand specific circumstances and specific questions. So as you see, a very complex opinion here when it comes to Africa, but one that I certainly think is at least changing in comparison to what it was a few years or a few decades ago.
One step at a time, one day at a time. Thomas, thank you so much for that update. Thomas Sparrow is political correspondent with our partners, DW, and he joined us all the way from Berlin in Germany. As we do always here on The Pulse, we cross over and get you to understand world affairs, especially also from an African perspective. This is still The Pulse. Keep watching.